The man she loved wanted her dead. The man who saved her wanted her to live. The first thing I noticed about her was the way she carried wood. Not the bruise along her cheekbone, though I saw that too. Not the dress that had been mended so many times the original cloth was more patched than garment. The first thing was the wood, a bundle of split pine she was hauling from the shed to the house, cradled against her side like she was trying to keep herself warm with it rather than carry it. Head down, moving fast, the way you move when you expect someone to be watching. I was fixing the gate post on the north end of my property when I saw her across the road. The Caldwell place. I'd bought my land 3 years prior, and in that time I had spoken maybe a dozen words to Harlan Caldwell, and none at all to his wife. He wasn't the neighboring kind, and I was past the age where I went looking for company. I watched her make 2 more trips. On the second one she dropped a split log and it rolled under the porch railing, and she went down on one knee to fish it out, and when she straightened back up she looked across the road, straight at me, for just a second. Not asking for anything, just seeing if I was going to be a problem. I went back to my gate post. My name is Emmett Crail. I'll be 61 years old come November. I spent 22 years as a deputy and then a sheriff in 2 different counties across 2 different territories, and I have seen more of what one person will do to another than I care to remember. I thought, when I came out here to this valley, and bought this piece of land from a widow who was heading back east to her daughter, that I was done with all of that. A man reaches a point where he's put enough things right and watched enough things go wrong that he just wants some ground of his own and some quiet. I had the ground, I mostly had the quiet. What I knew about Harlan Caldwell was what the valley knew, that he'd come from somewhere in Oklahoma with money enough to buy the biggest spread in 30 miles, that he'd married this woman. Nora was her name. I learned it later, about 2 years after setting up, and that he ran his place hard and his hands harder, and nobody stayed working for him more than a season. What I knew from my own eyes was that he had a voice that carried across a road, and that I'd heard it raised plenty of times and had heard things break. I knew other things. I'd been a lawman long enough to read a yard the way you read a face. The Caldwell yard was the yard of a place where somebody was always braced for something. The wood was stacked too close to the house, not laziness, but urgency, the kind where you don't want to be too far from a door. The kitchen curtains never opened on the side that faced the barn. Little things. The kind of things you only notice if you've learned to look for them, and I had been looking for them since I was 30 years old, and a deputy named Cress taught me that what a man doesn't say and what a yard doesn't show are sometimes more important than anything you can find directly. So I knew, in the way you can know something without being told it, what was happening across the road. I'm not telling you I did nothing for as long as I did nothing because I didn't care. I'm telling you I did nothing because I was not sure yet what doing something would cost her. I've seen men go after a woman harder when an outside party steps in. I've seen it end badly. I've seen women who were in a manageable kind of bad place get put into an unmanageable one because somebody well-meaning went charging in without thinking it through. And I have been in enough situations where my reading was right, and the timing was wrong to know that the timing matters as much as the reading. So I watched. I kept my eyes open the way you do when you're working a problem and you don't yet have enough to act on. The thing that changed it was a Thursday morning in late October. I was up before light, the way I always am, the way a man's body just keeps doing after 40 years of early mornings, whether he needs to or not. I had coffee on and I was standing at the window looking out at nothing in particular, the dark, the shapes of the fence line, the faint gray coming up over the eastern ridge, when I heard the sound from across the road. A woman's voice, high and sharp, not a word I could make out, just the pitch of it, and then a sound I'd heard before and never liked, the particular flat knock of a hand against a wall or a wall against something softer. I had my coat on before I thought about it. My boots. I took my rifle from the rack by the door, Not because I went over there planning to shoot anyone, but because a man in my position, at my age, walking into someone else's property in the dark before sunrise, you bring what makes you credible. You bring what signals that you are not a man who came to negotiate. I went across the road. The Caldwell house was lit up inside. Yellow window light spilling into the yard. The door was not fully closed, just pushed to, and through the gap I could see the lamp on the table, and I could see Nora Caldwell against the far wall with her forearm up and Harlan in front of her, and the way he was standing told me everything I needed to know about what he was about to do. I pushed the door open and walked in. Harlan turned around. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, running to fat now, but the kind of fat that doesn't slow a man much. He had that look in his eye that I have seen on men when they're in the middle of something and they resent the interruption. Like you've walked into a room where they were conducting business. I did not say anything. I just stood in his doorway with the rifle low at my side and waited for him to make the first calculation. "The hell are you doing in my house?" he said. "I heard something," I said. "You didn't hear a damn thing. That was your business." "I'm making it my business." He looked at the rifle. He looked at me. He was doing the arithmetic men do, measuring what they think they're owed against what they think the other man will cost them. And the thing about a man who's spent his whole life running everything around him is that he genuinely cannot believe, when the math doesn't come out his way, that the math is right. He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him deciding to push. "Get out of my house, old man," he said, "before I do something we'll both regret." "I don't think you'll do anything tonight," I said. And something in how I said it, the quiet of it, the fact that I wasn't raising my voice to match his, the fact that I was not moving and was not going to move, something got through to him that maybe this was not going the way he'd figured. He was used to people who flinched. I had stopped flinching at men like him a long time ago. He looked at Nora, then back at me. "I'll remember this," he said. "I imagine you will," I said. I stood in that doorway until he picked up his coat off the chair and went out the back, and I listened to him cross the yard and heard the barn door slide and then creak shut, and then nothing. I waited another few minutes after the nothing. Then I looked at Nora Caldwell, who was still standing against the wall with her arm partway raised and her eyes on me and her face very still. "You all right?" I said. She lowered her arm. She was somewhere around 40 years old, not a soft woman built for work, and she had a kind of steadiness to her that I thought must have cost her enormously to keep in that house. There was blood at the corner of her lip, fresh blood. She touched it with the back of her hand and looked at it and then back at me. "I don't need help," she said. "I know," I said. "I came anyway." She didn't say anything to that. I turned and went back across the road. The next 2 days I didn't see her. I went about my work. There's always work on a piece of land, always something that needs fixing or moving or watching, and I didn't go back over there, and I didn't send anyone over there, and I didn't talk to anyone in town about what I'd seen. That's a particular skill, knowing when to keep your mouth shut, and I had spent a long time learning it. You talk too early and you change things. You give the wrong people information they'll use wrong. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is hold what you know close and wait for the situation to tell you what it needs. On the 3rd day, she came across the road. I was in my barn working on a saddle. The stitching on the near side had given and I was punching new holes. The old kind of work that smells of leather, oil, and horse, and that occupies your hands while your mind goes where it wants. When I heard the scrape of the door, I looked up and there she was, standing just inside, backlit by the October light, and she had a tin of something in her hands that turned out to be apple preserves from her own kitchen. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said, "that was all." I put down the punch and wiped my hands on my trousers. She came a few steps in and looked around the barn the way a person does when they're sizing up an operation, at the tools hanging on the wall, the order of them, at the horses, at the way the straw was laid, at the general condition of things, and I had the feeling she was used to reading a place fast, and that she'd done it on instinct her whole life, gauging what kind of man lived in a space before she decided how much of herself to show. "He'll be in town tonight," she said. "He goes into Harmon Creek on Thursdays, stays till late." "All right," I said. "I wanted to say thank you." "You don't have to." She looked at me then, not the way a person looks when they're being polite and trying to find the right words for it. The way a person looks when they're deciding whether to trust the information their eyes are giving them, whether what they're seeing is what's actually there. "How long have you been over here?" she said. 3 years. "You were a lawman." It wasn't a question. I said, "How'd you know that?" "The way you stood in the door," she said. "Men who have held a badge a long time, they stand a certain way, like they've done it before, like they expect to have to do it again and they've already made peace with that, like the situation doesn't surprise them." I didn't say anything to that because she wasn't wrong. The surprise goes out of you eventually. You've seen enough of what people will do that nothing quite reaches the place that used to register shock. What replaces it is something more like a long, sad knowledge, and you either let that knowledge harden you, or you find a way to carry it without it taking everything else with it. "What's your name?" she said. "Emmett Crail." "Nora Caldwell." She paused, and something moved across her face, brief and complicated. "Nora Beale before." She set the preserves on my workbench. She looked at me once more, that same direct look, and then she went back out into the light. I watched her cross the road and go through her gate, and that was that. I stood in my barn for a while after, not really working, just holding the saddle punch and thinking about the way she said that. Nora Beale before, like she was keeping track of who she had been. Like that person was still in there somewhere, and she hadn't let the years in that house take her entirely. What I want to tell you, and I want to be honest about it, is that I was not in the business of falling in love. I wasn't even in the business of thinking about it. I had been married once, a long time back, to a woman named Delia who died of typhus when we were still young enough that I hadn't understood yet what I had. She was 29. I was 31. We'd had 6 years together and a child who didn't survive his first winter, and when she went I was left with a grief I didn't have the vocabulary for, the kind that doesn't announce itself as grief, but just quietly takes up residence in you and rearranges everything from the inside. I had carried that for a long time, 25 years. Eventually I had put it down somewhere, not forgotten it, but put it where it didn't have to be carried every day, and I had made a life that didn't require anything from anyone, and that was, in its way, sufficient. You get used to it. You learn what you can do alone, and you stop noticing the edges of what you can't. You become a man who is good at his work and reliable and decent, and who comes home at the end of the day to quiet, and the quiet doesn't hurt anymore because you've stopped hearing it as absence. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened between me and Nora Caldwell was not something I was looking for, and not something I was running toward, and not something I made happen. I am almost embarrassed by how slowly I understood what was happening. A man my age ought to be able to read a situation. I had spent decades reading situations for a living, but there are some situations a man misreads because he has stopped believing they're possible, and that was what happened here. October turned to November. The cold came down off the mountains the way it does up here, sudden and certain, the kind of cold that comes in on a north wind overnight and is just there the next morning like it was always going to be. I found reasons to be working near the road. Not every day, not so it would look like anything, but enough. She would be out sometimes, doing what a woman does to keep a place running, hauling water, working the kitchen garden though the season was long past the point of yielding anything, carrying things from one place to another, the endless round of it. We'd exchange a word or two, about the weather, about a fence post that was leaning toward her side of the road, about whether the snow would come early this year or late. Small things, the kind of things neighbors talk about. But there was something underneath them, something both of us knew was there and both of us were careful about. The way you're careful around a fire that's just catching. You don't want to move too fast and put it out. I noticed things. The way she thought before she spoke, never putting out the first thing that came to her. The way she laughed, it happened rarely, and when it did it was real, not the kind of laugh women use to make a man feel comfortable. The fact that she never complained. Not about the cold, not about the work, not about anything. A woman who had been living in that house for years without complaining had either given up on being heard or had decided that what she felt was hers to keep, and I thought it was the latter. Harlan noticed. Men like Harlan always notice. They don't see much that's real, but they see threat, and they see anything that might be taking something they consider theirs. He came across the road one afternoon, a cold day, the sky the color of old iron, my breath misting in front of me as I split wood in the yard. I heard him coming. He was not a quiet man, and I set the axe in the block and turned around and waited. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't shift my stance. I just waited with my hands at my sides. He stopped 10 feet away. His face had that arrangement it got, jaw forward, eyes narrowed, working himself up to something he'd already decided on before he walked over. "I see you talking to my wife," he said. "I talk to my neighbors," I said. "She's my wife, not your neighbor." I looked at him. I said, "She lives across the road." "That makes her my neighbor. I'm telling you to stay away from her." I reached down and pulled the axe out of the block. I set it against my leg, blade down. Not as a threat, just something to do with my hands. I said, "You're welcome to your opinion, Harlan." He didn't like that. He was a man who was used to his opinions being treated as orders, and there is something that happens to such a man when the person in front of him simply doesn't respond the way the order is supposed to work. His jaw shifted. He looked at the axe and then at my face. "I've got friends in this valley," he said, "men who owe me." "I imagine you do," I said. "You don't want trouble with me." "That's true," I said. "I generally don't look for it. Doesn't always care what I'm looking for." He stood there a while longer. He wanted something to grab onto, some sign of weakness or hesitation, and there wasn't any. After a while he turned and went back across the road, and I watched him go through his gate and into his house, and I picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. That night I heard them. Not words, just volume, the rise and fall of it through whatever the night is made of. And then nothing, which was sometimes worse. In the morning I found a cup on my porch step. A coffee cup, one I didn't own, left sometime in the dark, and inside it a piece of cloth folded small, and on the cloth in small, careful letters, "He says he'll kill me before he lets me leave." I held that piece of cloth for a long time. I held it and I read it again, and I felt something settle in me. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger and colder. The kind of thing that happens when you've been watching a situation, and the situation finally tells you what you already knew. I put the cloth in my coat pocket. I went and got my coffee and I drank it on the porch in the cold, and I thought it through the way I had always thought things through, from the outside in, looking at every angle before I settled on what needed to be done. I want to tell you about the night it came to a head. But before I do, I want to tell you something about what it means to be a man of a certain age who has spent most of his life doing what's right because it's right, with no particular reward for it and no particular expectation of one. There comes a point, not a single moment, more like a long, slow settling, like sediment going down in a glass of water, where a man stops expecting anything back. He does what's right because that's what he does, because he decided a long time ago what kind of man he was going to be, and he's kept to that, and he doesn't look for it to come back to him. And most of the time it doesn't, and that's all right. That's just how things are. You make your peace with it. You find satisfaction in the work itself, in the doing, in being the man you said you'd be. But something happens to a man over the long run of that. something that doesn't announce itself and that you don't fully notice until something comes along and shows it to you. You start to believe, somewhere underneath where you think about things, that you are not the kind of man that anyone chooses, that you are the kind of man people are glad of, that people rely on, that people think well of from a distance, but not the kind anyone walks toward with wanting. Not at this age. Not looking like you look and carrying what you carry. What I'm trying to say is that when Nora Caldwell came to my door at 2 in the morning on the 1st of December with her lips split, and one eye beginning to swell shut and a carpet bag in her hand, and she looked up at me in my doorway with that same steadiness she always had, that steadiness that had clearly cost her years to maintain, and she said, quietly, without drama, "I need somewhere to be for a while." What happened in my chest in that moment was not simple and not small, and I will not pretend it was. I said, "Come in." I sat her at my kitchen table. I got a cloth and a bowl of cold water, and I cleaned the cut on her lip, which was deeper than the one from the first night, and I looked at her eye, which was swelling in a way that told me the next morning was going to be worse. She sat there and let me do it without flinching and without crying, not because she was not feeling anything, but because she had learned in that house that showing it only made things worse. She had trained herself so thoroughly that the stillness was just how she was now. When I was done, she said, "He told me tonight that he'd bought a piece of property over in Dalton County, that he was going to move out there in the spring, and I told him I wasn't going." She paused and looked at the lamp on the table. "He told me there were 2 ways to leave a marriage. I could leave with him or I could leave in the ground." I folded the cloth. I set it down on the table beside the bowl. The water in the bowl was faintly pink and I didn't look at it. I said, "Where is he now?" "Asleep. He drinks when he's angry. He gets furious and then he drinks and then he sleeps like the dead. He'll sleep through till morning." "All right," I said. "I don't know what I'm asking," she said, and for the first time the steadiness cracked slightly, not into tears but into something more like exhaustion, the kind that lives behind the eyes and makes them look deeper than usual. I don't have family here. I don't have money that's mine. I don't have anywhere that's." "You've got a place to be," I said. "That's enough for right now." She looked at me. That look again, the one that was measuring something, deciding something. She said, "Why?" And I thought about that. I thought about what the honest answer was, and whether to give it yet or to give a smaller, safer version of it. I said, "Because some things are wrong and some things are right, and you are in the wrong situation, and I have the means to change that. And because I have spent a very long time knowing what I'm capable of and not having much call to use it for anything that mattered. This matters." I stopped. "That's most of the answer." She heard the part I didn't say. She was that kind of listener. She said, "What's the rest of it?" "I would like you to be all right," I said. "That's all." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp was burning low, and outside the wind was up, and the cold was leaning against the house. She said, "Nobody said that to me in a very long time." I put her in the spare room, which I'd been using mostly for storage, old tools, saddle blankets, a box of things that had been Delia's that I'd never known what to do with, and I cleared enough space for her to breathe and put fresh bedding on the narrow bed and left her to it. Then I sat up the rest of the night in the kitchen with the rifle across my knees and a cup of coffee that went cold before I drank half of it, not because I expected Harlan to come looking in the dark, but because I had learned long ago that the man who relaxes too early is the man who gets surprised, and I was not about to be surprised. He didn't come. Morning came gray and cold, the light the color of tin, and I heard Nora moving around in the spare room, cautious sounds, trying not to wake me, not knowing I'd been sitting 10 feet away all night. And I put the rifle back on the rack and started the coffee over, and by the time she came out, I was standing at the stove like a man who'd slept. She looked at the coffee and then at me. She knew. She had that look like she knew, But she didn't say anything about it, just sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup I set in front of her and looked at the steam coming off it. "What happens now?" she said. "Now you rest," I said. "And we figure out the next thing after that." What followed was about 10 days of the hardest kind of quiet, the kind where something is building underneath the surface, and you can feel it but you can't push it and you can't stop it. Harlan knew. He wasn't stupid about that kind of thing. He'd have found her gone by mid-morning, and he'd have looked at my place across the road and he'd have known. He didn't come charging over, he let it sit. I've seen that before. Men like Harlan, they don't always come charging in with noise and fire. Sometimes they wait. They let you think you've won something. They let you settle, let your guard come down a little, and then they move. I didn't let my guard come down. I went about my days, and Nora went about hers. She was not a woman who could sit still, and the stillness of someone else's house clearly cost her, so she found work to do. Within the first day, she had found 3 things in my kitchen that needed doing and done them. Within the first week, she had rearranged the whole kitchen in a way that was honestly more sensible than how I'd had it. I'd been putting things where they were easy to reach. She'd been thinking about the logic of the whole operation, and had fixed a small leak in the back roof that I'd been meaning to get to since September, and had found the tear in the left elbow of my good coat that I hadn't noticed, and mended it so well you couldn't see the seam. I watched her work without saying much about it. There was something in the way she moved around a space that was starting to be familiar. The particular way she held her head when she was thinking, slightly tilted, like she was listening to something. The way she hummed without seeming to know she was doing it. The way she went still and quiet when something outside made an unexpected sound. The animal alertness of it, before she relaxed again when it turned out to be nothing. We were careful with each other. Polite in the way people are when they're aware of something between them and are not ready to name it. We ate at the same table and talked in the evenings by the fire, and found, over those 10 days, that we were not short of things to say. She had opinions. A lot of them, and well considered, the kind that come from a person who has had a long time to think quietly with nobody listening. On one evening, she took apart my position on a land use dispute I mentioned involving 2 ranchers south of Harmon Creek, and by the time she was done, I had mostly conceded she was right. She didn't crow about it. She just moved on. She told me about herself in pieces. Over coffee in the mornings, when the light was coming in and neither of us was ready to start the day yet. Or in the evenings when the fire was going well and the dark was outside and the house felt like its own small thing, separate from everything else. She had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 5, her father a farmer who'd worked himself into an early grave by 60, and her mother a woman she described as capable and quiet and gone too soon. She had married Harlan when she was 27, a decision she made not because she loved him but because she was tired and he had seemed solid. A man with land and means and a manner she'd mistaken for steadiness. And there were not a lot of solid things around her at that time. She had stopped believing that was a good reason to do anything about 6 months after the wedding. She didn't say that bitterly. She said it the way you say something you've had a long time to make peace with, the way you report the facts of a thing that is over. The kind of voice that isn't asking for sympathy, just putting the fact down on the table where it can be seen clearly. One evening she said, "What was she like, your wife?" I hadn't said much about Delia. I was surprised she knew. "People talk," she said, reading my face. "I know they do," I said. I thought about it. I said, "She was the kind of person who made you feel like you were doing better than you were, like whatever you brought to the day was enough. She had this, she never said much, but when she looked at you, you felt like you were worth looking at. I didn't know to be grateful for that when I had it. By the time I understood what it was, I didn't have it anymore." Nora was quiet for a while, watching the fire. Then she said, "How long has it been?" 30 years. She nodded slowly. She said, "Do you think a person can start over at this age?" And I wanted to say the right thing. I wanted to say something true that was also kind, that was honest without being bleak. I said, I think a person can start, whether it's over or just something new, something that doesn't need to be compared to what came before, something that has its own shape. I think that's possible. I think I'd like to believe it's possible. She didn't say anything back, but she didn't look away either, and we sat there for a while longer than we might have, both of us looking at the fire, and the silence between us was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. The trouble came on a Wednesday night, middle of December, snow on the ground and more coming. I could smell it before dark, that particular heaviness in the air, the sky going a flat white that isn't clouds so much as sky going solid. I heard a horse in the yard at about 10 o'clock, and I was already at the window when the lamp light caught Harlan and two other men I didn't know coming up from the road. The two men had the look of hired work, and not the ranch kind. They sat their horses the way men sit horses when they're expecting to have to move fast or have someone run from them. One of them had a rifle out across his saddle. I said to Nora, she was at the table, she'd heard the horses. She'd seen my face change. I said, "Spare room. Lock the door and don't come out until I say." "Yemmit." "Nora," I met her eyes. I kept my voice level, the same voice I'd used in 2 decades of situations where level mattered. "Please." She looked at me for 1 second, then she went. I took the rifle and checked it and took the pistol on my hip. I'd been wearing it every day since she came over, old habits from old work, and I went out the front door before they could knock. Because it's always better not to let a thing come to you. You walk out to it, into the open, on your own terms, with the lamp behind you and the dark in front of you and whatever they brought with them. There were 3 of them. Harlan in front, the other 2 fanning out a little on either side, spread apart by maybe 15 feet. They'd done that on purpose. The geometry of it was meant to make one man feel small. I came out onto the porch and stopped in the lamp light from the window and let them see me clearly and let them see the rifle in my hands and the pistol on my hip. And I did not say anything, and I did not move. "Evening, Harlan," I said, after the silence had done its work. "I've come for my wife," he said. "She's not your wife," I said, "not in any way that counts. The law says different." "The law's 20 miles away," I said, "and you and I both know you haven't sent for it." He glanced at the 2 men, some kind of signal or reassurance. Then back at me, he said, "You're one man." "That's right," I said. I let him look at the rifle again. I said, "I've been one man most of my life. Generally works out." The man on Harlan's left, the one with the rifle across his saddle, shifted his weight and started to bring the rifle up, and I turned my head and looked at him and I said quietly, "Don't." Just the one word. And something in how I said it, the absence of anything theatrical in it, the fact that it came out of me the same way a man says the sky is gray, just a fact, just what was true, stopped him cold. He sat very still with the rifle not quite raised. There are men who speak the language of violence, not the theatrical kind, not the bluster and the threat and the big movements, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having actually been in it and having understood the cost and having kept going anyway. And there are men who only think they do, who have learned the gestures without the grammar behind them. And when those 2 kinds of men face each other across a dark yard, the one with the grammar doesn't have to say much. The other one can hear the difference. Harlan felt it. I could see him feeling it, the place in him where the confidence was supposed to be showing him something unexpected. "She belongs with me," he said, but the force had gone out of it a little, the way it does when a man realizes mid-sentence that the argument isn't going to land. "She's made her own decision," I said, "and I'm going to stand by it." He looked at the house, he looked at the windows, he looked back at me and tried one more time. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," I said, "has been for a while." He stood in my yard for another long moment, doing that arithmetic, and then he said something under his breath that I didn't catch and didn't need to, and he turned his horse, and the 2 men turned with him, and they rode back out to the road. I watched them go until I couldn't hear the horses anymore and couldn't hear anything but the snow coming down and the wind moving in the pines. I went inside. I knocked on the spare room door. I said, "They're gone." The lock clicked. The door opened. She was standing there with the small pistol she'd had in the carpet bag when she came. She'd told me about it her second day here. I'd told her to keep it close. And she had her arm lowered but not fully, and she was looking at me like she was looking for damage. She stepped forward and she put her hand against my face. Her palm was warm and rough and real, and she held it there and looked at me like she was checking something, the way you check a thing you've been afraid to lose. And I stood there and let her. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "Yes, I did." "You could have been hurt." "Could have been," I said. "Wasn't." She kept her hand against my face for another moment. Then she said, quietly, "Why are you doing this, Emmett? I want you to tell me the real reason. Not the right thing to do, not what a decent man does, the real one." I thought about that. I had been thinking about it for weeks, in the slow, careful way you think about things you're not ready to say out loud but that you know are true. I said, "Because I think you are the best person I have been close to in a very long time. Because I think what you've got in you, that steadiness, that will, I think that is rare, and I do not want to see it put out. And because—" I stopped. She waited. She had a patience to her that was its own kind of gift. "Because I would like," I said carefully, "to have a reason to keep being the kind of man I've tried to be. Not just the doing of it, a reason. And I think you might be that reason, if you ever wanted to be." She looked at me for a long time. The lamp was on the kitchen table and the fire had gone down to coals, and outside the snow was coming harder now, and the world outside the windows was entirely white and entirely silent. Inside was the lamp and the coals and us. She took her hand from my face. She put both her arms around me and she pressed her face against my shoulder and she held on, and I put my arms around her, and I felt the whole long weight of what she'd been carrying, and what I'd been carrying, and what it was to put it down somewhere together. We stood there in my kitchen in the dark and in the quiet. I don't know how long enough. I'll skip over some of it. Harlan tried twice more before it was finished. The first time he came alone in the afternoon, 3 days after the night with the 2 hired men, and he'd been drinking since morning, and the whole shape of him was wrong. All the careful restraint he kept on himself in cold sobriety was just gone, and what was underneath it was ugly in the way mean things are ugly when they've got nothing covering them. He came into my yard on foot shouting things that weren't fully words, and he had a rifle, and I walked out to him, and I took the rifle away from him. That sounds harder than it was. A drunk man telegraphs every move 3 beats before he makes it. I got the rifle and I turned him by the shoulders and I walked him back to his horse, and I helped him up into the saddle, and I pointed the horse down the road, and I slapped the horse's flank, and that was that. I don't know what he told himself about that. I don't particularly care. The second time he went to the sheriff in Harmon Creek, a man named Aldous Cork who I had known for 2 years and who was a reasonable man, and he made a formal complaint about his wife being held against her will. Cork rode out to my place and talked to me, and then rode over to the Caldwell place and talked to Harlan, and what exactly got said over there I never asked, but Harlan did not come back again after that. Cork told me, on his way back through, that he'd let Harlan know that Nora had come to my place of her own free will, that she'd stated clearly her intention to remain, and that any man who made further trouble was going to find the law considerably less sympathetic than it had been so far. Cork was that kind of lawman, not theatrical about it, not given to speeches, but very clear about what would and would not happen. I shook his hand and thanked him, and he said, "Emmett, I think this is going to work out better than the other thing." I didn't ask him what he meant. I thought I knew. That February, Nora filed the papers. It took most of the spring, which is how these things go. There were lawyers involved, one in Harmon Creek and one in the county seat, and a judge who had to look at the matter 3 separate times before he saw it the right way, and it cost money, And I paid for it not because I was asked to, but because I had the money and she didn't, and that was the end of the calculation as far as I was concerned. She argued about it. She had a particular look she got when she was arguing about something she was going to lose. This set to her jaw that I had come to recognize. And I had come to recognize also that once she had the set jaw look, the best thing you could do was let her argue it out, and then she'd accept the reality. She paid me back 2 years later, every cent, tracked to the dollar, and presented me with a piece of paper she'd written it all out on that she made me sign saying the debt was discharged. I told her she was the stubbornest woman I had ever encountered, and she said thank you, and that was that. She did not move into the main part of the house right away. She kept the spare room through the summer, which was her choice and which I respected, and we worked the land together and ate supper together and talked in the evenings by the fire, and the house that had been quiet and sufficient became something else, something I didn't have a name for at first, something that was fuller in every dimension than it had been. One night in June I was at the kitchen table and she was at the window watching something outside. A deer, it turned out, a doe at the edge of the tree line, and she turned around and walked across the kitchen and kissed me. Just like that. Plain and decided and certain, the way she did everything. And then she looked at me to see what I'd do. I did what any sane man would do. We got married in September with Judge Aldous Cork. Cork had gotten himself elected judge the previous year, which seemed right to me, and 2 neighbors as witnesses. And she wore a blue dress that she'd made herself from cloth she'd bought in town. And the light was the way it gets in September in this valley, golden and long. And Cork shook my hand afterward and said, "Emmett, I think you finally did something smart." I said, "Took me long enough." Nora laughed at that, the real laugh, the one that happened when she wasn't thinking about it, and that was the best thing I heard all day. What I want to tell you, what I've been working toward, I suppose, since I started talking, is what it is to have a good woman beside you at this age. It is not what I expected. Or maybe it is exactly what I expected, and I just never believed I'd actually have it. There's a difference between knowing a thing is real and believing it will happen to you. She does not look at me the way a young woman looks at a young man. She is not looking at possibility, at what a person might become. She looks at me the way a person looks at something they have examined and decided is worth keeping. Like they've gone through the whole inventory, the flaws, the age in the joints, the years that show on a face, the things a man doesn't say about himself and doesn't need to because they're visible if you look, and made the choice with their eyes open, not choosing the best of what's available. Choosing the thing they actually want. I have been overlooked most of my adult life. Not entirely. I was good at my work and people knew it, and there's a kind of respect that comes with that, a particular acknowledgement that keeps a man going. But in the particular way that men who are steady and quiet and not given to display get overlooked. You become part of the furniture. You become the thing people rely on without thinking much about it, the man who is just there when you need him, solid and predictable. And after a while you stop expecting anyone to see you, the real you, not the useful thing you provide but the actual man underneath the doing and the steadiness, the man who has doubts and who grieves and who carried something alone for 30 years. Nora sees me. I don't know how to explain what that is worth. I don't have the words for it, and I'm not sure the words exist for what it does to a man when a good woman looks at him, and he can tell that she is seeing all of it and she is choosing it anyway. Not in spite of the years and the quiet and the grief he carried. Not overlooking those things, seeing them and staying. She is not a soft woman. She is not simple or yielding or easy. She is her own person entirely, with her own mind and her own will and her own ideas about how things ought to be done, and about half the time her ideas are better than mine, and she knows it and she's not shy about saying so. She will not agree with me just to make things smooth. She will argue a point until it's settled to her satisfaction. She has opinions about everything from the best way to store root vegetables for the winter to the proper approach to a land dispute to the way I'm handling my left knee, which has been bothering me since spring. And she is right about the knee, and I have grudgingly admitted as much. She chose me knowing all of that, not because she had to, not because there was nowhere else to go. She had proven by walking out of that house with a carpetbag in the middle of a December night that she was willing to have nowhere rather than stay somewhere that was wrong. She could have gone to Harmon Creek. She could have gone back to Missouri. There were choices. She chose this. She looked at me, a 60-year-old former lawman with a piece of land and a quiet and a history he carried alone, and she decided that was what she wanted. A man who has not had that does not know what to do with it at first. I kept waiting for it to be conditional, for there to be fine print somewhere that I'd missed, some clause that would come clear later. You learn over a long enough life to be cautious about good things, not because you're ungrateful but because you've seen enough of how things go to know that good things have conditions. But she just keeps choosing. Every morning she gets up and she is here and she is mine and I am hers, and it is not complicated. I am sitting on my porch as I tell you this. It is a September evening, the 4th anniversary of the day we married, and the light is going down behind the western ridge in that particular way it does up here in September, slow and orange and enormous, the kind of light that makes the ordinary world look like it was worth the whole trouble of living in it. The horses are in and fed. The work is done. There is always more work, but today's is done, which is all you can ask. There is supper on the stove that she made, a venison stew with potatoes and some of the dried herbs she put up in August, and in a minute she'll come to the screen door and she'll say my name and I'll get up and go in. I'll sit across from her at that same table where I cleaned her lip with a cold cloth on a night in December 4 years ago. We'll eat supper and talk about what needs doing tomorrow, and she'll tell me something funny that happened earlier in the day, something she saves up for supper, and I'll laugh at it. We'll argue a little, probably, about something small. She'll read afterward and I'll work on something with my hands because I don't know how to sit still entirely any more than she does, and the lamp will burn low and the fire will settle, and it'll be another ordinary evening of the only kind of life I want. I have done a lot of things in my 60-some years. I have stood between danger and people who needed protecting, and I have held the line in situations where the line needed holding. I have done the work without expecting thanks for it, and I have done it when it cost me something, and I have done it when there was no one watching, and when I was tired, and when I wasn't sure it would make any difference. I did it because it was right. I did not do it expecting a reward. But if I were a man who kept a ledger, if somewhere there were a set of books on what I'd put in and what had come back to me, what Nora Crail gives me every day of her life would settle every debt I ever thought the world owed me and then some. She gives me a reason. Not to be good, I was going to be that either way, but to let it matter, to let it be for something. To believe that what a man builds in himself over a long lifetime is worth building, because it turns out there is a woman somewhere who can see it and who will walk toward it with her eyes wide open. The light is almost gone now, orange going to purple going to the first stars, faint but there if you look for them. Somewhere inside I can hear the stove, I can hear her moving. And here she comes.